Theories of personality. What is personality? It is the unique way a person thinks, feels, and acts throughout life. It must not be confused with character, which is the value judgments made about a person's morals, nor temperament, which is the enduring characteristics each person is born with. The study of personality started out in the 4th century BCE with Empedocles, followed by Hippocrates, whose work inspired Galen. The traditional perspective in personality theory are the psychodynamic perspective, behavioral perspective, humanistic perspective, and trait perspective. Psychodynamic perspective was pioneered by Sigmund Freud, and it emphasizes the unconscious mind. The behavioral perspective focuses on how the environment affects behavior and how interactions with others and thought processes influence learning and personality. Humanistic perspective focuses on the role of each person's conscious life experiences and the role of choices in personality development. Trait perspective is different with the other three in a way that it is more focused towards the end result rather than the causes. Now let's take a look at the origins of the psychodynamic perspective. The psychodynamic perspective was founded by Sigmund Freud. Many people found his perspective very unusual, since most of it was related to sex. Freud was born in Europe during the Victorian era, a time when there was sexual repression. Men were believed to be unable to control their animal desires, while the women were not supposed to have any sexual urges, which was why many of Freud's patients were women who had problems because of their unfulfilled desires.
One of the ideas Freud came up with under this perspective were the divisions of personality. Freud believed that personality had three divisions. The first division was the id. It is the first and most primitive part of personality that is completely unconscious, pleasure-seeking, and arousal. It exists at birth, and this is where you can find the basic biological drives like hunger, thirst, self-preservation, and sex. Yes, Freud believed that babies have sex drives. This shocked and outraged a lot of people. But what he really meant by sex drive was actually the pleasure drive, because infants need to seek out pleasurable sensations. Infants are a good example for describing the id. They want their needs to be satisfied right away, and they do not care about the consequences. But that does not mean that Freud's idea was right. The next part is the ego, which deals with the harshness of reality. It is mostly conscious, and it is more rational, logical, and cunning compared to the id. It works on the reality principle where it tries to satisfy the demands of the id in ways that will not lead to negative consequences. Lastly, the last division of personality is the superego. This develops as children learn the rules, customs, and expectations of society. This is also where the conscience can be found. After finding out the differences of the three divisions of personality, you may be wondering, how do the three work together? Well, when you were a kid, do you remember watching a type of scenario in cartoons where when the main character has problems, suddenly a small devil or angel would appear on their shoulders? Well, in that scenario, the id is usually the devil, the superego is the angel, and the ego is the main character. The three parts of personality work in a way that the id would give the more desirable and pleasurably satisfying option, while the superego would give the restrictions and consequences of those options, and the ego would come up with a plan to quiet the id but satisfy the superego. Sometimes the id or the superego do not get their way, and this would result in a great deal of anxiety for the ego. It is only when the anxiety created by this conflict gets out of hand that disordered behavior arises. The anxiety caused by the conflict of the personalities can be dealt with through the psychological defense mechanisms. The first psychological defense mechanism is denial. Denial is the refusal to recognize a threatening situation. The second is repression, where the person pushes threatening events out of their conscious memory. The third is rationalization, where they make up acceptable excuses for unacceptable behavior. The fourth is projection, where one places their own unacceptable thoughts onto others. The fifth is reaction formation, where the person forms an emotional reaction opposite from their own unacceptable thoughts. The sixth is displacement, and this is when the person expresses their feelings that would be threatening if they directed it to the real target, to something or someone else. The seventh is regression, This is when the person falls back to their childlike patterns. The eighth is identification, where the person tries to become like someone else. The ninth is compensation or substitution, and this is when the person tries to become superior in another area of their life to make up for the things they're bad at. And the last is sublimation, where they turn socially unacceptable urges into socially acceptable behavior.
Now let's talk about the psychosexual stages of the psychodynamic perspective. Freud believed that personality development happens in a series of psychosexual stages that are determined by the developing sexuality of the child. If the child gets stuck in a stage, when he or she grows into an adult, he or she may carry emotional and psychological baggage. The first stage is the oral stage. It takes place on the first 18 months of a child's life. The erogenous zone is the mouth. The conflicts that can arise here is over weaning. Weaning earlier or later than supposed to can result into little or too much satisfaction of the child's oral needs and the activities and personality traits associated with an orally fixated adult personality. Overeating, drinking too much, chain smoking, talking too much, nail biting, gum chewing, and being either too dependent and optimistic, which happens when the oral needs are overindulged or the person becomes too aggressive and pessimistic because their oral needs are denied. Next is the anal stage, which happens when the child is 18 to 36 months old. The erogenous zone is the anus. The area of conflict here is toilet training. This invasion of reality is part of the process that stimulates the development of the ego during this stage. The fixation in this stage has two outcomes. The child who rebels openly will refuse to go in the toilet and has an anal expulsive personality. This is someone who sees messiness as a statement of personal control and who is somewhat destructive and hostile. On the other hand, children are terrified of making a mess and they rebel passively and they refuse to go at all or retaining the feces. No mess, no punishment. When they become adults, they will be stingy, stubborn, and excessively neat. That type is called the anal retentive personality. Next is the phallic stage, which happens to children of 3 to 6 years old. The erogenous zone shifts to the genitals. Children have discovered the differences between the sexes by now, and most have also engaged in perfectly normal self-stimulation of the genitals. This awakening of sexual curiosity and interest in the genitals is the beginning of the phallic stage. Freud believed that when boys realized that a girl had no penis, they developed the fear of losing their penis called castration anxiety, while girls developed penis envy because they were missing a penis. The conflict in this stage centers on the awakening sexual feelings of the child. Freud believed that boys developed both sexual attraction to their mothers and felt jealousy towards their fathers during this stage, a phenomenon called the Oedipus complex. To deal with this anxiety, two things must occur by the time the phallic stage ends. The boy will repress his sexual feelings for his mother and identify with his father. For girls, they experience the Electra complex, with their father figure as the target of their affections and their mother as the rival. The result of identification is the development of the superego, the internalized moral values of the same-sex parent. Fixation in the phallic stage usually involves immature sexual attitudes as an adult. People who are fixated in this stage will be in vain. This vanity is believed to cover up feelings of low self-worth arising from the failure to resolve the complex. The other is lack of moral sexual behavior, which came from the failure of identification and the inadequate formation of the superego. Men with this fixation may be mama's boys, who never really grow up, and the women with this fixation may look for much older father figures to marry. Latency stage happens to children who are 6 years old until they reach puberty. At the end of the phallic stage, children who push their sexual feelings for the opposite sex into the unconscious, in another defensive reaction, repression. Children will remain in this stage for hidden or latent sexual feelings. In this stage, children grow and develop intellectually, physically, and socially, but not sexually. Lastly is the genital stage, which is seen when the child is at the age of puberty. When puberty begins, the sexual feelings that were repressed can no longer be ignored, since their bodies are changing and the sexual urges are allowed into consciousness. But these urges will not target the parents, but they would be attracted to other adolescents, celebrities, and other objects of adoration. Since Freud tied personality development into sexual development, the genital stage is the final process in Freud's personality theory. It's also the entry into adult social and sexual behavior.
As we know, some of the ideas Freud came up with were a little different from the usual. Some were even ridiculed by a lot of people, especially doctors and psychologists in the past and even until now. There were early psychoanalysts who objected to his emphasis on biology and sexuality, but they retained some of his concepts like the id, ego, superego, and the defense mechanisms. One of the psychoanalysts who had some objections about Freud's ideas was Carl Jung. He disagreed with Freud about the nature of the unconscious mind. He believed that there was more to it than just the personal fears, urges, and memories of people. He also believed in a collective unconscious, which contains a kind of species memory. These are memories of ancient fears and themes that can be found in folktales and cultures. He called the collective universal human memories as archetypes. Another neo-Freudian was Alfred Adler. He disagreed with Freud on the importance of sexuality and personality development. Adler developed a theory saying that as young helpless children, people develop feelings of inferiority when comparing themselves to more powerful, superior adults in the world. He believed the driving force of all human endeavors, emotions, and thoughts was not seeking pleasure, but seeking superiority. He also believed another theory which says that the birth order of children affects their personality. Karen Horney was another neo-Freudian who went against Freud's view about the differences between males and females, especially with the concept of penis envy. She countered this with womb envy, which says that men felt the need to compensate for not being able to bear children by striving for success in other areas. She also focused on basic anxiety, which is created in a child who is born into a world that is bigger and more powerful than him or herself. People whose parents did not bring them up securely develop neurotic personalities, and they handle their relationships in maladaptive ways. Lastly, Erik Erikson, who is also neo-Freudian, did not support Freud's emphasis on sex, but he emphasized the importance of social relationships at every stage of life. Even though Freud's work is not as relevant as it was before, there were still some concepts or ideas he made which are still being used and studied until today, one of which are the defense mechanisms, which are used to describe the defensive behavior and irrational thinking of people. Another concept is the unconscious mind. Although most professionals view his theories with skepticism, his influence on the modern world cannot be ignored. It has made a huge impact on the different types of media, and it has continued to spark the interests of people. Aside from the psychoanalytic perspective, another theory of personality is the behaviorist and social cognitive view of personality. Two theories that started out similar and ended up moving in different directions are behaviorism and social cognitive theory. Behaviorism is a psychological theory that attempts to explain personality or why people behave the way they do. Behaviorists define personality as a set of learned responses or habits. They believe that everything a person or animal does is a response to some environmental stimuli that has been reinforced or strengthened by a reward in some way. Social learning theory expands the ideas presented by behaviorism. Like behaviorism, social learning attempts to explain why people behave the way they do. However, in the social cognitive view, behavior is governed not just by the influence of external stimuli and response patterns, but also by cognitive processes. The social cognitive theory actually started as a social learning theory developed by Albert Bandura in the 1960s. Bandura believes that three factors influence one another in determining patterns of behavior that make up personality. These three factors are the environment, the behavior, and the personal or cognitive factors that the person brings into the situation from earlier experiences. These factors affect each other in a reciprocal or give and take relationship, which Bandura calls reciprocal determinism. Bandura also talked about self-efficacy, which refers to a person's expectancy of how effective their efforts to accomplish a goal will be in any particular circumstance. American psychologist Julian Rotter expanded upon Bandura's ideas and developed the term locus of control, which is the tendency of people to assume that they either have control or do not have control over events and consequences in their lives. The next theory of personality is humanism and personality. Humanism is the third force that evolved as a resistance against the limitations of the psychoanalytic and behavioral perspectives. It contradicts these two perspectives because both are deterministic. Behaviorism concentrated on the reinforcement of the stimulus-response behavior, while psychodynamic perspective focused on unconscious and involuntary forces that influence one's thoughts and actions. One major proponent of humanism is Carl Rogers. He proposed the concepts of self-actualization, self-concept, and positive regard. Self-actualization emphasizes the idea that people strive for fulfillment. In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization is at the top, and before it can be attained, the other needs must be met first. While self-concept is an image of who a person is as an individual, and it is composed of the real self and the ideal self. The real self is how people actually perceive themselves in terms of traits and abilities, while the ideal self reflects what people want to be. If there is a great similarity between the two selves, then there is congruence, the degree by which one's self-concept aligns with reality. If the two selves don't match, then there is incongruence. Lastly, positive regard is the love, warmth, and affection people receive from important individuals in their lives. It can either be conditional or unconditional. Conditional positive regard is love, warmth, and affection based on pleasing others by doing what they want, while unconditional positive regard is love, warmth, and affection that enables the person to reach self-actualization.
Trait theories. Trait theories attempt to describe personality in terms of one's trait. A trait is a consistent, enduring way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. According to Alport, traits were wired down to the nervous system to guide people among different situations, and that each person has a different constellation of traits. Raymond Cattell identified two types of traits: surface traits and source traits. Surface traits refer to traits that are easily seen by others, and source traits are basic traits that underlie surface traits. The five-factor model consists of 5 factors that constitute human personality. The first factor is openness, a person's willingness to try new things. People who don't like change score low for openness, while the more curious people score high. Second factor is conscientiousness, which is a person's organization and motivation. People who score high are ambitious, organized, and reliable, while people who score low are lazy and careless. Third factor is extroversion, a term used by Carl Jung, who believed people can be divided into two personality types, namely introverts and extroverts. Extroverts are outgoing and sociable and score high, while introverts are solitary and reserved and score low. Agreeableness refers to the basic emotional style of the person, where trusting and helpful people score high, while rude and uncooperative people score low. Neuroticism refers to the emotional stability and instability, where anxious and insecure people score high, and calm and relaxed people score low.
Next is the biology of personality. Behavioral genetics is the study of genetic and environmental influences on behaviors. It is devoted to the study of learning about how much of one's personality is due to inherited traits. So twin studies show identical twins share 100% of the genetic material, while fraternal twins share only 50%. Studying twins helped the researchers find evidence of possible genetic influences on various traits. A study has revealed that identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins when it comes to intelligence, leadership abilities, the tendency to follow rules, and the tendency to uphold traditional cultural expectations. And they are found to be more alike in nurturance, empathy, and assertiveness. Aside from studying twins, behavioral geneticists also study adoptive children and their adoptive and birth families. Through these studies, they can discover the influence of environment. They may also find some of the shared and non-shared environmental and genetic influences on personality. Studies have confirmed that genetic influences account for a great deal of personality development, regardless of shared or non-shared environments. The current findings on the biology of personality show that the concept of heritability is important in the study of genetics. It plays a central role in the psychology of individual differences and to determine some traits which can be attributed to a genetic influence. Several studies have found that the 5 personality factors of the 5-factor model have a 50% rate of heritability across several cultures. Studies point out that 5 to 50% of personality traits are inherited, which means that the environmental influences a person is raised in accounts for only half of one's personality traits. There are different ways to assess one's personality, but we will be discussing 4 types. The first type is interview, wherein the psychologist questions their client and records the answer in a survey process. There is no particular structure, and the flow is natural from the start of the conversation between the psychologist and the patient. An issue here is that clients might lie or keep true information to themselves. There is also the halo effect, which is the tendency to form a favorable or unfavorable impression of someone at the first meeting. The second type are projective tests, wherein psychoanalysts show ambiguous visual stimuli to their patients and ask them what they see. A common projective test is a Rorschach inkblot test, which was created by Hermann Rorschach. The participants were asked to look at each inkblot and tell what is it that they see. And psychologists evaluate the responses on key factors such as size, shape, and response to the whole or to the details. Because the participants have different perceptions, projective tests are subjective. It is not a science and is inaccurate. Aside from reliability and validity, projective tests may be outdated. However, it is still used by many psychologists and psychiatrists. The third type is behavioral assessment, wherein direct observation is used to quantify behavior through rating scales and frequency counts. For this type of assessment, there are 2 problems: observer effect and observer bias. Observer effect is when a person's behavior is affected since they're being watched. Observer bias can be controlled by the presence of multiple observers and correlating their observations with each other. Lastly, there is personality inventories, which includes a standard list of questions that can be answered with yes or true and no or false. It is more objective and reliable, but the client can give false answers and some might give certain answers without taking it into consideration.
Now let's look into how psychology was applied to our everyday life. In 1796, Dr. Franz Joseph Gall, a German physician, developed a theory of personality traits based on the shape of a person's skull. It was known as phrenology and became popular in the 19th century. There's also Dr. Colin de Young's study, which suggested that there are indeed certain areas of the brain associated with certain personality traits. He believed that there were evidence for the biological seat of 4 of the Big Five, which are extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. The first one being extraversion, which is associated with higher volume in the medial orbitofrontal cortex, which has something to do with recognizing the value of rewarding information. Secondly, neuroticism is associated with a lower brain volume found in several areas of the brain, respond to threat, punishment, and negative emotions. Thirdly, agreeableness is associated with areas of the brain that are connected to the intentions of actions and mental states of others. The fourth one is conscientiousness, which is associated with the left lateral prefrontal cortex that is connected to the working memory and voluntary control of behavior. Last is openness, which is associated with the fifth of the Big Five traits, but failed to find any significant differences. With all the different concepts about personality, we can only continue to wonder how complex one's personality can be. Just continue to stay curious about how and why you and other people act the way they do.